Hey there. I was making this scene recently for a 3D challenge where these two mice were the main characters, and I was rendering with Eevee, and I wanted the fur on these mice to be kind of stylized, not really realistic at all because it wouldn't match the feel of the scene. So I'm going to show you a few tricks to get that look, and then as a bonus, I'll add a quick and dirty wind effect at the end. Okay, before we really get too far, I want to make sure that we're using the Eevee render engine. So I'm going to use that, and then I'm going to enable ray tracing. And then under the curve section, I want to make sure that I'm using strip and not strand, because otherwise the hair strands won't really have any volume to them. So I just want to make sure that that's set to strip before we really get too far. So I'm going to add a round cube. And just going to scale that down a little bit and then shade it smooth. And I also want to add a little bit more geometry to this. So I'm going to turn on the wireframe just so I can see what I'm doing a little bit. And then I'm going to add a subdivision modifier with Control 1 and then apply that right away. Now, before we add the hair system to this mesh, we need to make sure that we have a UV map to work with. So I'm just going to quickly unwrap that with a sphere projection. I'm just going to quick go to the UV editing tab, select my mesh, make sure that we have a nice UV map. Looks good to me. Now I think it's going to be easiest while we work to be in material preview mode with an actual HDRI so we can just see how the light is falling on this thing and how the normals are going to behave, because that's really important when we get to stylizing the fur on this object. Now you can add a quick fur setup under the curve menu. So if you hit Shift A, go to curve, and then go right down to fur, it'll just kind of add basically a stack of modifiers. And I don't really love the frizz curves, one like the frizz modifier. I'm just going to get rid of that one. Okay, now we're kind of set up to do some work. But before we do that, I want to split the viewport up into a few sections. I'm going to use a geometry nodes editor on the bottom, and then the top, let's make that the shader editor. Okay, now if you look at the curves object, which the hair system added as a child of the round cube that I created, you can see that it already has a material attached to it, and I want to use nodes for this because we're going to work on this in a bit. But first, I want to give a little bit of volume and thickness to the hair itself. So under that first modifier, which is the curve profile modifier, I'm going to change the radius and make that a little bit bigger, maybe like 0.01. And we can kind of change the shape profile a little bit to kind of thicken it up towards the end of the strand. So now we can see what we're doing a little bit more. And it looks pretty terrible in my opinion. So one of the first tricks we can do is to get rid of the shadow. I don't want the hair strands casting shadows on anything really. I don't want it casting shadows on itself or the base mesh that it comes out of. So we can go to the object properties tab, and then under the visibility section, uncheck shadow. So that makes it a little bit better, but it's still nowhere near what we want. Now you can see when I rotate this thing around a little bit that each strand of fur has its own normals that is reacting to the light from the HDRI. And that makes a lot of sense. That's what it should do, but it doesn't look the way we want. Now, if I hide the fur and just take a look at the base mesh for a second, what I really want here is each strand of fur to basically copy the normals from its root position on the surface mesh, okay? If that makes sense. So we have all these normals coming out of the base mesh, and I want that point from which the hair is rooted, I want the entire strand of hair to have that same normal. So it kind of takes on this very uniform look. Okay, I'm going to bring the hair back. Now look at the interpolate hair curves modifier and go down to the output attributes section. And this is fantastic. It gives you for free the surface normal of the root from each strand of hair. It's great. I used to have to, in my scene, I did all kinds of work to sample the surface from the root and then transfer the normal. It was a mess. I didn't even realize that it just gave that to you without doing any work, and you can use that to transfer the normal. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So you can access this surface normal right in the shader by adding an attribute node and then typing in exactly surface underscore normal, and then connecting the vector output of that into the normal input of the shader itself. Now that looks better, but we're still not quite there yet. And because we're using ray tracing with Eevee, we need to go into the materials tab and then go down to settings here. And then under the render method, dithered I think is the default method. We need to change that to blended. So when we have ray tracing, blended is going to react to the light in a more predictable way that makes a little bit more sense visually. Okay, now this looks much better, much closer to what at least I was after in my scene. But now that I'm looking at this example here that I'm building for you, it looks a little bit dense with hair. So I think a quick way to make this look a little bit better is to go into the interpolate hair curves modifier again. And under the viewport amount, I'm going to take this down quite a bit, maybe somewhere around here. I think that looks a little bit better. And then maybe let's thicken each strand up, and we can do that with the hair curve profile. Okay, looks great, right? We're done. Not quite. Look at this. So if you rotate the mesh around, look what happens. The normals aren't really updating or reacting to the light in real time. It's almost like they were baked at the moment that the normals were read by the shader, and then it just kind of was frozen there. So if you change the orientation or if you transform the object, it's just not going to update. So obviously that doesn't work, but luckily there's an easy solution for this. What we need to do is go back into the fur shader, and we need to do one quick operation on the normals that we get from geometry nodes that we're providing to the shader here. So right now the normals are kind of in their own world. They're in objects. They're in their own object space. We need to convert that to world space, and there's a great node to do that. It's the vector transform node. So add that in there and stick it right in between the attribute and the shader, and change world to object and object to world. We want to go from object to world. So now when we rotate around, you can see that it's using world space. So it doesn't really matter how we transform the object, which is exactly what we need, especially if you're animating things like I was. Okay, great. So now let's think about color a little bit and how we might change the color of the strands of fur and the base mesh beneath it. So I'm going to hide the fur, and let's look at the base mesh, and we're going to use the base mesh to define the color, not only of itself, but of the fur from where it's rooted. Now, there's a few ways to do this. You could use UV textures, but it's a little bit more work than I want to do right now. So a quick way that I like to use is to use color attributes, where you can just paint really directly on the vertices themselves. So let's add a color attribute. You can just keep it named color, and we'll need to add a material to the base mesh. I'll just call it base. And to retrieve that color information, add a color attribute and then select color, which is the color attribute we just added before. And if you hook it up directly into the base color of the shader, it'll just be black, or whatever default color that we picked when we added the attribute. If you go into vertex paint mode and just start painting around, we're just going to paint some white with the default brush. I'm just going to paint like a band around the center. Okay, looks good. And I'm going to use that color attribute to drive the factor of a mix color between two different colors, and just pick any two colors. I'm going to leave the first color default, and I'm going to pick like a blue color for the second one. So anywhere it's black, it's going to use A, or the white color, and anywhere it's white, it's going to use the B color, which is the blue. Okay, so the base mesh looks good. Now, if I turn the hair back on, we can access that same attribute that we used on the base mesh. How can we do that? How does the hair or fur nodes even know about that attribute? Well, so if we go over, just for a quick second, the geometry nodes workspace, and then over in the spreadsheet area, if you look at the spline under the curve domain, you can see that there's a color attribute already baked in here. So it's kind of inheriting the color attributes from the vertices that are on the mesh from which those fur strands are coming out of, if that makes sense. So anyway, back over to the shader. We can access that attribute with an attribute node and then enter color for the name. And if we hook up the color to the base color of that shader, we can see that it's working, right? So let's add our mix color node again. Let's drive the factor with that color attribute. And let's pick the same color that we did for the base mesh. I'm going to go back over there. I'm just going to copy that blue with Control C, go back to my curves object, paste it in there. There. And you can see that the hair strands are now the same color as the vertex colors on the base mesh. Pretty cool. But now we have two mixed colors in two places. I don't really want that. So what I'm going to do is make a node group out of this. So with the mixed color selected, I'm going to hit Control G with that. I don't need to specify these A and B color inputs, so I'm just going to get rid of those for now. And I'm going to tab back out of this. So now I have this mix color node group. I'm going to copy that, go back to the base mesh, paste that in there, and then use that node group instead of the mixed colors that we started with. So now if I go into this node group, I can change the color here, and it changes wherever that node group is used, which is in two places right now, the base mesh and the fur nodes. So now we're kind of set up to go back into Vertex Paint if we wanted to, and paint some more or blur the color attributes if we wanted to. We can really do whatever we want here. Cool. Looks good. Okay. All right. So yeah. All right. I told you at the beginning of this video that I would add kind of a wind effect. I used that on my video because these mice were flying through the air and I wanted this sense of motion. So I just kind of came up with this quick kind of hacky way to do it. There's add-ons and really complicated, fancy ways to do this, but I didn't need any of that. I just wanted something pretty quick. So I'm going to show you exactly what I did in my scene here. On the hair curves object, add another geometry nodes modifier. We'll just call that wind. And the node that really is the magic behind all of this is called displace hair curves. So I'm going to throw that in there and just kind of mess around with the vector displace, and you can kind of see basically what it's doing, except I'm going to add a noise texture in there. I'm just going to hook this up directly to show you what's going on. Obviously that's terrible. We need to calm this down a little bit. And the first thing usually that you want to do with a noise texture is take the color output, which is a bunch of values, random values that range from 0 to 1. That's why it's pushing everything away from the base mesh. That's why that's happening. We want to kind of make those values centered around 0. So we're going to subtract 0.5 from each of those vector components, and now it's kind of averaged out around 0. Next, let's scale things down. It's way too intense, so let's maybe make that 0.1 or something or whatever looks good to you. Now, you don't have to do this, but I think it looks a little bit better. So instead of each strand of hair responding to the noise texture in each of the 3 Cartesian directions, I only want them to be affected on X and Z, I think. So I'm going to multiply the component of the direction I don't want it to react to by 0, basically just cancel it out. So I'm just going to take the Y component, multiply it by 0. So now the noise is only kind of affecting it on X and Z, or Z for you people around the world. Okay, so now how are we going to make this move? We need to shift the coordinates of the noise texture along some direction so that it looks kind of like wind is blowing it from a single direction. So we're going to add to the default position of the texture, we're going to add some value along a certain direction. So I'm going to add to the position probably something along the Y direction here, which is the center component here. So I'm going to just mess with that value a little bit to see what I want. It looks like I want a negative value over time. So I'm going to use a scene time node to get the seconds of the scene and feed that into the Y component, and then combine all that into what we're adding to the position, okay? So I want the direction to be the other way, so I'm going to multiply the seconds by -1, and that's a little bit more what I want, although the noise texture is a little too intense. I'm going to take the scale down a little bit. to 3. I think that looks a little better. Okay, and lastly, I'm not sure if I put this here or maybe it was earlier in the chain, but anyway, we want the hair to kind of be blown in a certain direction. So I'm going to just take all the values that we're displacing it and just push it in one direction. I think I'm going to push it in the positive Y direction. So it kind of like, it's just pushing everything along that direction. Again, this is kind of quick and dirty, nothing super fancy here. And I think it might look a little bit better if the hair were longer. So I'm going to go add a trim hair curve. So I'm going to put it after the profile, and let's multiply the factor by something like 1 point something or 2 even, just to make it look a little bit longer. And yeah, that's basically how I did that. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So the trick is basically a few things. Turn shadows off, transfer the normals from the base mesh to the fur, and then make sure that you're using blended mode for the material if you're using ray tracing on Eevee. That's basically the trick. Thanks for watching. Hope that helps you out. See you next time.